If you're curious as to why government officials and politicians in America right now ostensibly care so much about the people of Venezuela, well, let me just explain it to you in the most simplest way possible. They don't care about the people of Venezuela at all. In fact, what they care about is something very different. They have an agenda.
Trying to get that oil. Oh!
It's all about the oil. So by speaking out, they're claiming to speak out on behalf of the Venezuelan people, but in actuality, all they want is to jack Venezuela's oil. And that has become painfully clear as of late, not because you can see the evidence pointing to that being the conclusion, but because they've admitted that this is their ultimate goal. Now, to kind of give you the rundown as to how we got to this point, in 1999, socialist Hugo Chavez came to power in Venezuela and promised to carry out the vision of Simon Bolivar. Now, what he began to do was nationalize private industries that were of particular interest to the United States, and that includes oil. Now, what made Hugo Chavez unique was that he was one of the only leaders in Latin America that decided to stand up to U.S. imperialism, and he refused to let foreign powers and large multinational corporations exploit his country's oil wealth. Now, this led to, you could have guessed, a coup attempt in 2002. Now, even though it's the case that, the Bush administration and the CIA had intelligence about the upcoming coup, and they even met with those who were planning to carry out the coup, well, they totally had nothing to do with it, guys. They assure us that that's the case. Now, anyone who knows anything about the situation in Chile with Allende, and just in general, U.S. involvement in Latin America, this was their response to the United States' denial. Yeah. Now, fast forward to 2013, Hugo Chavez died and Nicolas Maduro came to power, which was hopefully another opportunity from the standpoint of the US to actually do what they want in Venezuela. But then learning that Nicolas Maduro was not going to be a puppet to the United States like his predecessor, what did they try to do then? Well, they teamed up with Israel and Saudi Arabia to artificially drive down the cost of oil, thus undercutting Venezuela's oil profits and hurting their economy overall. Because if Saudi Arabia is flooding the global market with cheap oil, then obviously Venezuela is going to have to compete, and that's in turn going to hurt their economy. But if you hurt their economy, what do? You destabilize their entire country, because Venezuela, they haven't diversified their economy, so they're basically relying almost exclusively on oil. So you undercut their economy, you destabilize the country. And then what happens? Well, social and political unrest follows, and that's exactly what happened. And once the country was destabilized and you had the social and political unrest, well, then followed sanctions from the United States the year after by President Obama, and that, of course, exacerbated the situation. We basically broke Venezuela for our own greedy purposes. And it got to the point where the country became so unstable that the opposition party who's against Maduro has essentially been trying to goad the United States into intervening because that would behoove them. Why? Because it would help them come to power. Now, speaking of the opposition party, just last week, Juan Guaido, who's the leader of the opposition, decided to just willy-nilly declare himself president of Venezuela. Now, unsurprisingly, the United States acknowledged him as the president. Trump actually acknowledged him as the legitimate interim president via Twitter, and Maduro then called for U.S. diplomats to leave, but of course the U.S. refused to comply, citing Maduro's lack of legitimacy since they now don't view him as the rightful president. They view Guaido as the rightful president. So now we're in a situation where we want that oil so bad, we're willing to do everything, including possibly invading Venezuela. Now, I'm not being hyperbolic, and in this video, I think that what we're going to see from Trump's administration, particularly his national security advisor, John Bolton, a warmonger, is going to give you all the information you need that will make clear why we care so much about Venezuela. It's not about the people of Venezuela, it's about the oil in Venezuela. Now, that's basically an oversimplification. Everything that I've told you about isn't the full context. You can take a full 10-week course on Latin American politics, as I did, and still not have all of the details. But for the most part, that's the bare minimum context that you need in order to really grasp the details of the story. Now, I do think more information is important, so I will supply you with a link to a video done by David Dole of the Rational National, who gives you a really thorough, in-depth breakdown of the situation, and I will also link you to a Secular Talk video where you will watch Kyle go on one of the best rants you've ever seen, where he basically speaks for all of us and talking about the absurdity of the situation and how the president declared a coup d'etat via Twitter, all under the guise of caring about the Venezuelan people, when it's very clear that this is all about the oil.
We have TSA workers not getting paid, 800,000 federal workers not getting paid. They have to go to fucking food banks to make sure that they eat. And you're gonna tell me you care about Venezuelans? Try caring about Americans, you fuckhead!
So I'm not going to give you the deep dive on the issue in particular, but what I'm going to do is shed light on our government's nefarious agenda. Because I think this is a pretty easy issue if you're progressive. Regardless of how you feel about Maduro, you should be against the coup, because it's not our duty to determine who is or isn't legitimate. We don't get to say that Juan Guaido is the interim president simply because there are people marching. There are other people marching against Juan Guaido. So that's not on us to say. But what I think is really important is we establish why we're doing this. And we're doing this for self-interested reasons. So it's clear that Trump's administration wants Maduro out and Guaido in. So what do you do if you want to overthrow a government? You hit them where it hurts. You announce sanctions on their oil company, so Maduro's government then loses revenue and in turn can't pay his military, and as a result gets bucked from power even faster, because if it's the military that's propping you up and the military is no longer supporting you because you're not paying them, then obviously that means you're on your way out. That's what you do, and it's exactly what Trump's administration is doing, because here's John Bolton explaining that he's announcing new sanctions on Venezuela's oil company.
We're going to announce sanctions against Petroleras de Venezuela, Sociedad Anima, or PDVSA, as it's known by its Spanish acronym, the state-owned oil monopoly. We have continued to expose the corruption of Maduro and his cronies, and today's action ensures they can no longer loot the assets of the Venezuelan people. We expect, and Secretary Mnuchin will go into this in more detail, that today's measure totals $7 billion in assets blocked today, plus over $11 billion in lost export proceeds over the next year.
So the goal of these new sanctions is to further destabilize the country and to make it so Maduro starts losing support among the military. Because if he loses the military, he essentially loses the country. That's the goal of this new round of sanctions. Now, Donald Trump claimed that this is all being done at the behest of the Venezuelan people, but unfortunately for him, John Bolton may have revealed a little bit too much, because in an interview with Trish Reagan on Fox Business News, he actually made it very clear it's not about the Venezuelan people. They have a very clear goal. It's to take Venezuela's oil. That's what he said here. Watch very carefully and listen to his words here, because he's not going to say this explicitly, but he is going to say this in a roundabout way.
Today here in Washington, we've been looking at ways to disconnect Maduro from the financial resources he needs to pay the military and otherwise keep himself in power. That could be a very effective way, we think, of helping the legitimate government.
How do you do that?
Well, there are a number of things we could do. You know, we have already informed the Federal Reserve that Guaido is the real interim president, the legitimate government, which means that all official Venezuelan financial assets in this country now belong to interim President Guaido. Maduro doesn't have control over it any longer. We're looking at the oil assets. That's the single most important income stream to the government of Venezuela. We're looking at what to do to that. We want everybody to know we're looking at all this very seriously. We don't want any American businesses or investors caught by surprise. They can see what President Trump did yesterday. We're following through on it.
So if you think of a company like Citgo, which is owned by PDVSA, which is the state-run oil company there in Venezuela, we have a lot of those Citgo assets right here in the U.S. Is that something, for example, sir, that you're looking at?
Yeah, well, we're in conversation with major American companies now that are either in Venezuela or, in the case of Citgo, here in the United States. I think we're trying to get to the same end result here. You know, Venezuela is one of the three countries I call the troika of tyranny. It'll make a big difference to the United States economically if we could have American oil companies really invest in and produce the oil capabilities in Venezuela. It'd be good for the people of Venezuela. It'd be good for the people of the United States. We both have a lot at stake here, making this come out the right way.
I want to repeat that because it's very important what he's saying here. It'll make a big difference to the United States economically if we could have American oil companies really invest in and produce the oil capabilities in Venezuela. Do you understand what he's saying here? And the implications of what he's saying here? That was Donald Trump's national security advisor, one of the most influential individuals in Trump's administration, admitting that we're meddling right now with another country's affairs, another country's internal affairs, specifically because we want that oil and we're angry that their current president isn't giving us access to their natural resources. He's admitting it. These are things just, a couple of decades ago that you would never catch a public official admitting. But now, they've become so emboldened by never-ending wars and support from the media now going along with these never-ending wars that they feel inclined to just say their goal on national television. Yeah, we don't really care about the Venezuelan people. We want their oil. This is unbelievable. Now, to make matters worse, think about the context of the situation. That was the national security advisor saying we should take their oil. Now, the buck ultimately stops with Trump. And if Trump doesn't want to do that, Trump can say, no, John, we're not going to do that. However, let me remind you what Donald Trump said with regard to Iraq's oil.
We should have kept the oil when we got out. And it's very interesting. Had we taken the oil, you wouldn't have ISIS. Because they fuel themselves with the oil. That's where they got the money.
So you believe we can go in and take the oil?
We should have taken the oil. You wouldn't have ISIS if we took the oil.
So that's what he said in 2017 about Iraq. Now, hypothetically speaking, what happens if these new sanctions don't do what they're intended to do? What if they don't weaken Maduro ultimately? What if he thwarts off this coup attempt like Hugo Chavez thwarted off a coup attempt in 2002? What happens if they don't accomplish what they intended to accomplish? How far would they be willing to go? Is military action possibly on the table? Well, according to John Bolton, we're not ruling out anything.
You've mentioned the word significant response. How do you define significant response?
Well, we're not going to define it because we want the Venezuelan security forces to know how strongly we think that President Guaido, the National Assembly, the opposition, and most importantly, American personnel are not harmed. This is an unequivocal statement on our part.
Is there any circumstance under which American forces would get involved?
Look, the president has made it very clear on this matter that all options are on the table.
I was shocked when I saw that, and I shouldn't be shocked. This is John Bolton. He's a neocon's neocon. He'd invade Canada if he could. But there he is, just saying it openly. All options are on the table. That's code for a military invasion is also on the table. So think about this. We're in this situation where Maduro ordered U.S. diplomats to leave the country. So let's say, hypothetically speaking, they refuse, which they have, since the United States says anything Maduro says, any order he issues, doesn't count. It's invalid because he's not the legitimate president. It's Guaido. What happens if the police arrest those American diplomats? Well, as John Bolton alluded to there, we're going to protect our personnel. Nothing's off the table. Now, throughout the course of this press conference here, John Bolton accidentally revealed his notes. And if you take a look at his notes here, it says 5,000 troops to Colombia. Now, if you think that this was a mistake, that he didn't want this to get out, then you'd be mistaken, because what he was doing here by, quote, accidentally revealing his notes is sending a message to Maduro. If you don't leave, we're coming for you. That was a threat. It wasn't an accident that he wrote in plain English here, 5,000 troops to Colombia. That's not an accident. You don't just accidentally reveal that information. You want that information to get out, and that's what he did. He wanted that information to get out. So just to really put this story in the most simplest terms possible, this is not surprising. This is what we do in Latin America. We break Latin American countries, all so that way we can get in and take their resources, or install a puppet who will give us the resources. It's happened countless times in Latin America. It happened in Iran when we decided to overthrow their democratically elected leader to install a puppet who would actually work with the United States. I mean, we support 73% of the world's dictatorships. Do you honestly think that people like Donald Trump and John Bolton care about the authoritarianism of someone like Maduro? Of course they don't care. They don't give a shit about the Venezuelan people. This is all about the oil. And if I've accomplished anything in this video, I hope I've made it clear that that's what their agenda is. And don't take my word for it. Take their word for it.
Girly Mike Fettuccine needs your support on Patreon. What a loser. Visit patreon.com/Humanist Report to support the low ratings Humanist Report. Sad. My views are much higher.